Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to take a closer look at one of the most famous and honestly most misunderstood stretches of water on the entire planet. We're talking about a massive 500,000 square mile zone in the Atlantic Ocean that connects Miami, Bermuda, and San Juan. Now, over the years, this huge expanse has been blamed for the disappearance of hundreds of ships, dozens of aircraft, and sadly, over 1,000 lives. We all know it as the Bermuda Triangle. But what is actually going on out there? Are we talking about a supernatural vortex, some crazy magnetic anomaly, or is this just the most successful myth in modern history? Well, let's find out.
Okay, let's dive into this. To really understand how this myth got started, we have to go back to the inciting incident, the one that sparked the whole thing. It was December 5th, 1945, and 5 Navy bombers, known as Flight 19, took off from Fort Lauderdale for what was supposed to be a completely routine training flight. But just 2 hours in, the radio transmissions turned frantic. The flight leader, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, reported that their compasses had totally failed, and the ocean below looked wrong. He literally said they were flying over white water. And then they vanished. 14 airmen were just gone. And to make matters even worse, a Mariner rescue plane with 13 men on board was sent out to find them, and it vanished too.
So that brings us to Section 1, The Legend is Born.
Now, you might be wondering, how exactly does a genuine, heartbreaking historical tragedy turn into this massive supernatural phenomenon? Well, it wasn't the work of scientists or oceanographers, that's for sure. The myth was actually cooked up by pulp writers looking to score a bestseller. And it didn't happen overnight. This took decades to build. After Flight 19 was lost in '45, the story kind of just sat there until 1964. That's when a writer named Vincent Gaddis actually coined the term Bermuda Triangle in a pulp magazine called Argosy. He cleverly took all these completely unrelated maritime mysteries from over the years and just stitched them together into a single, sinister shape on the map. Then jump forward a decade to 1974, and an author named Charles Berlitz took that shape and absolutely supercharged it. He published a book called The Bermuda Triangle, throwing in wild claims about lost continents, alien abductions, time warps, you name it, the whole shebang. And this brilliantly illustrates just how massive this got. 20 million. That's how many copies Charles Berlitz's book sold. Readers literally couldn't tell where the historical facts ended, and pure imagination took over. By the mid-1970s, those staggering sales officially transformed a random stretch of the Atlantic Ocean into a highly lucrative brand, complete with glowing vortexes and UFOs slapped on paperback covers pretty much everywhere.
Moving right along to Section 2, Vanished into the Void.
It's definitely time we re-examine these famous cases, but this time strictly through the lens of actual maritime investigation. Let's start with Flight 19. The spooky mystery kind of evaporates when you look at the hard facts. Step 1, Lieutenant Taylor was flying with a broken compass in rapidly deteriorating weather. Step 2, geographic confusion. He genuinely believed he was flying over the Florida Keys, but he was actually way off over the Bahamas. Because of that fatal mix-up, he mistakenly led his 5 bombers further out into the open sea instead of back toward land, and they simply ran out of fuel. And step 3, what about that Mariner rescue plane? It didn't get sucked into some alien vortex. That specific aircraft had a known, documented flaw where fuel vapors could build up and tragically ignite. To the investigators, this wasn't paranormal at all. It was a devastating chain of mechanical failures and human error. But here is where things took a turn. Despite those completely mundane, understandable causes, the official Navy report threw in this one single, highly dramatic line. They wrote that the planes disappeared as if they had flown to Mars. Wow. Just that one poetic phrase, buried deep in an official document, was all it took. It gave the public the exact mystery they were craving, and it completely overshadowed the very real, tragic facts of the actual investigation. And of course, Flight 19 wasn't the only tragedy co-opted for this myth. Let's look at the USS Cyclops. Back in 1918, this massive 542-foot Navy collier just vanished with over 300 crew members on board while sailing from Barbados to Baltimore. No wreckage, no distress call. To this day, it's the largest non-combat loss of life in U.S. Navy history. But let's look at the actual conditions. The ship was carrying this incredibly heavy load of manganese ore. Experts point out it was overloaded due to a rushed cargo swap led by a captain with a pretty troubled reputation, and it was sailing straight into rough seas while possibly dealing with a structural failure. Honestly, you don't need a sea monster to sink a ship under those conditions. You just need a safety checklist that got ignored.
Okay, this is where it gets kind of ridiculous, especially when we compare the myth against historical fact with cases like the Mary Celeste. You've probably heard of this one, the famous ghost ship found in 1872, totally abandoned, just drifting with her cargo perfectly untouched and the half-eaten meal still sitting on the table. It gets folded into triangle lore all the time, but the historical fact? The Mary Celeste was found drifting off the Azores. That is literally thousands of miles away, near Europe. It perfectly highlights how these authors simply stretch the geography to fit a good, spooky narrative, regardless of the actual truth.
All right, let's get into Section 3, Chasing Scientific Explanations. So, if we aren't dealing with aliens or time warps, what is actually causing accidents in this specific region? Well, we have to think about how navigation worked before modern technology. The Bermuda Triangle region happens to be one of the few places on Earth that experiences something called agononic alignment. Basically, it's a navigational quirk where true north and magnetic north align perfectly. In the days before GPS, navigators relied almost entirely on compasses. If a pilot or captain forgot to account for this tiny little magnetic discrepancy in this specific area, their course could be off by just a few degrees. But when you travel hundreds of miles over open water, those tiny degrees compound, pushing a vessel incredibly far off its intended target. Add to that the very real, severe natural threats right in this corridor. First, you've got the Gulf Stream, which is one of the fastest, most turbulent ocean currents on the entire planet. It can easily sweep wreckage miles away before anyone even starts looking. Then, you have sudden, violent subtropical storms that can just pop up with almost no warning. And then there are methane hydrates. These are frozen deposits on the seafloor. Some researchers theorize that massive gas bubbles from these deposits could alter water density enough to actually sink a ship. But I want to be absolutely clear on this one. While the mechanism is scientifically fascinating, geologists confirm there is zero, literally zero, confirmed link between any active methane eruption and any of the disappearances credited to the triangle. This brings us to the real turning point of this explainer. When you actually look at the data, the hard, cold numbers, the rate of lost vessels in the Bermuda Triangle is exactly equal to the rate of loss in any other heavily trafficked stretch of ocean worldwide. The danger is not elevated at all. It's simply one of the busiest shipping corridors on the planet, and statistically, busy, stormy water is going to produce more accidents. To really hammer this home, money talks, right? Lloyd's of London, a company that insures more transatlantic shipping than almost anyone else on Earth, states this definitively. We don't charge higher premiums for ships sailing through it because the numbers don't justify it. Neither Lloyd's of London, nor the U.S. Navy, nor the Coast Guard recognize the Bermuda Triangle as a distinct region of unusual or paranormal danger. They don't deal in myths, they deal in statistics.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 4, Why the Myth Survives.
I really want to pose this question directly to you. If the science and the data are this definitive, if it's just bad compasses, bad weather, and turbulent currents, why on earth has this legend lasted for well over 60 years? Psychologists and folklore researchers hit the nail on the head here. Human beings are pattern-seeking animals. When we lose people to the sea in genuinely tragic, unexplained ways, we desperately want a reason. Saying it was just bad luck and bad weather feels incredibly empty and unsatisfying. But inventing a mysterious, uncontrollable force with a catchy name and a sinister shape on a map, that gives our grief an architecture. It gives us something concrete to point at. There's also a very simple psychological trick at play here called selection bias. This is a cognitive flaw where you tally up every single disappearance inside the triangle, but you completely ignore the millions upon millions of perfectly safe crossings. Literally millions of flights and voyages pass through those exact same waters every single year without a hitch. But because nobody writes a best-selling book or shoots a blockbuster movie about a plane that lands safely and on time, any patch of ocean can look cursed if you intentionally only count the crashes. At the end of the day, the ships and planes lost in the Atlantic were very real, and the heartbreak of their families was very real. But the paranormal reasons we've been telling ourselves for 6 decades, they just aren't. The Bermuda Triangle forces us to take a hard look at why we so often reach for the extraordinary instead of just accepting the facts. Maybe it's because a monster in the deep is somehow easier to face than the truth. Admitting that the vast sea is unpredictable, stormy, and sometimes entirely unforgiving means accepting that we just aren't completely in control. Which leaves us to wonder, what other monsters are we inventing today, just to avoid facing reality?